Tonight's debate is stick or twist. What are the choices for the next government on offshore wind? And as some of you will have seen, we've published a report today which tries to delve into what are essentially challenges of coordination and timing. I'm going to hand over now to Phillip Inman, our chair for this evening, who's very kindly joined us from The Guardian, where he's economics correspondent and takes an active interest in all things industrial policy. Over to you, Phillip.
Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce our panel members. I'm not going to tell you details about what they do. Hopefully they're going to tell you more of that when they talk to you for between 5 and 10 minutes about how they see things going. On my far right is Matthew Knight of Siemens, Business Development Director. He's going to talk to you, I assume, about what Siemens have been doing in their area. Ian Temperton, Head of Climate Capital, advising on people doing M&A and also fundraising in this sector. Colin Morgan of DNV-GL Renewables, that's a hell of a name, isn't it? Just to rattle off. Who's also in the advising market, and Aram Wood, Vice President of Statkraft, one of the funders of the report. So I'm going to start on my far left. Matthew, if you'd like to kick off.
We've now arrived at a situation where no power station of any kind gets built without being underwritten by a government contract. So effectively, government is choosing which power stations get built, whether they be wind, whether they be nuclear, whether they be gas. The whole of the energy industry, not just the offshore wind industry, needs greater clarity on which way we're headed. And as long as we don't have that, it pushes up the cost of everything. The apparent difference between this traded market price for electricity and the real cost of building any kind of new power station feeds the simplistic analysis that renewables are expensive. And it feeds the idea that we should keep our old power stations running for longer. Which in a purely economic sense makes some sense, but is absolutely disastrous for decarbonisation, and actually probably is quite disastrous economically, because what will happen is, over the next few years, if the capacity market just runs each year as it's doing this year, it will just go on rewarding 40, 50-year-old coal-fired power stations to stay on the bars, and it will delay the day when we start building anything new.
There is only so much money, and let's be clear, the current cost of offshore wind is too much. So if we're going to match those two kind of area under the curve problems, then we absolutely have to get the cost down very, very aggressively, and we have to figure out how we do that without using up too much of the curve or the area under the curve as we do so, because otherwise we'll just stop. At current costs, deploying too much is just going to use up too much budget. We'll get the political badwill that we are already generating in the industry, and it will stop.
We were quite involved in the whole cost reduction pathways work and so on, and the task force that went on a couple of years ago, and that 40% reduction target that's washing around does look quite achievable, and it'll be achieved by learning. It'll be achieved by supply chain companies investing. It'll be achieved by a bit more diversity in the supply chain, and it would be good if it was, and it's probably possibly essential for it to be achieved by a bit more diversity of ownership than we've had.
The glory days of 50 gigawatts of offshore wind in the UK by middle of the 2020s, I think, was unrealistic. I think anyone with a kind of a dose of reality and a sensible head always knew that was unrealistic, and I think that there would have to be a degree of reorganisation or restructuring in the offshore wind industry.
Well, if we look at the most expensive thing in an offshore wind farm, it is the turbines, and some of the projects that have just been built were tendered, were procured at a time when, if you went out to the market for a turbine, if you were lucky, you got 2 tenders. If you were unlucky, you got 1. Isn't that right, Matthew?
I don't know, we've tendered everything.
Projects that have been tendered in the last few years, there's been a lot more competition on turbine supply. So, the direction of travel's good in that, we've now got at least 3 or 4 credible offshore wind turbine suppliers.
We need governments to cooperate, to recognise that the only reason we're going to do offshore wind is if it can come down in cost. And I completely take the point. Every energy source, it's only worth pursuing if you can one day get it down to there or thereabouts with other similarly carbon-intensive forms of energy, and the way things are at the moment, with even higher forms of carbon intensity. It's just that different energy sources started that curve at different points. Coal started it 200 years ago, gas generation started it 100 years ago, offshore wind started it, let's be generous, 20 years ago, but realistically sort of 5 or 10 years ago. We haven't had a long to come down that curve yet. But we can see that given time and given deployment, we can get down to there or thereabouts. So there's an opportunity, and that's why we're doing offshore wind. There's a need for the governments around Northern Europe that have access to the sea and the wind to recognise that we're not blessed with that much sunshine, and solar power, if it's going to solve the rest of the world's problems, it's going to leave us at a disadvantage. And the challenge for Northern Europe is, can we build offshore wind at scale that's going to be competitive in our countries with the sort of energy price that there is in other parts of the world?
So I think offshore wind's got an existential question. The existential question is, can you deliver a globally cost competitive form of energy technology just in Northwest Europe? Because if you look around the world, China, US, everywhere else in the world has hydro, coal, nukes, gas, and they're globally deployed technology. Everybody uses the same kit. They all look the same. If you can't get close enough to see the label, you can't tell who's made it. Forgive me. And it's that global market that drives the efficiency that delivers you something that everyone's prepared to build. We can waffle on all day about Asia and floating turbines in Japan and sticking them off the Hamptons. The rest of the world isn't getting there in time to save us. So we are going to have to find a way. Some Europeans are going to have to find a way to be good, which is not always something that Europeans are very good at, but you never know, we might manage it. So I think we have a Northwest European market, and there is a question, is that ever going to be big enough and efficient enough in order to drive it? But it will just have to be.
But if I'm a simple-minded minister, and I'm thinking, well, I don't like this offshore wind, it looks very costly to me, I don't want to be the person in 20 years' time who's told, why on earth did you sign all those contracts, look at the cost of that electricity. But what alternative have I got if I haven't really got mass solar, and I've got to get rid of my coal, I've got to meet my target? Even if I don't really like offshore wind, surely I've got to go down the offshore wind route.
You do if you want to stick to your renewables and decarbonisation targets.
Right. Because there isn't anything else that will do the heavy lifting.
Physically isn't anything else.
I genuinely believe that there will be a £100 project in the current structure of the industry. The question is, what happens afterwards? Do we kind of work hard to get there? All of us as consumers have funded it. When do we get the return on investment? Do we just stop after we've come down the cost curve and let somebody else start deploying offshore wind? So that for me comes back to the kind of, well, what happens in the 2020s? How do we continue to kind of reap the benefit from the investment that's happened this decade? So that's about, for me, about a modest level of growth, not a heroic level of growth, but a modest level which is predictable. Whether there's a competition in there or not, I'm all up for competitive forces, but the model of offshore wind and the way that the competition works needs to change, because it doesn't match the development risk you have when you're doing offshore wind. And by that I mean developing a project can take 5 to 7 years and you're sinking £100 million in it. You're not going to do that to walk into an auction room. You just don't do it.
Yeah.
Can I just point out that you all just did?
Yeah, but that's because it wasn't an auction room that you're walking into. You're walking to a credit for the RO. So, the regime has changed 3/4 of the way through the game.
For each of the potential technologies, governments need to look at it and say, does it credibly ever have a chance of getting there or thereabouts? And if there's no chance that it ever would, stop spending any money on it. But if there's a credible story that it could get there at some point, you need to ask some very clear questions about how long will it take, what's the area under the curve of deployment to get there, and what's the kind of the yield after that point. And that's not about picking winners, that's about kind of just ruling out the no-hopers. But there are a collection of technologies, and to be fair to the government, they are the ones that are coming along at the moment, that do have that possibility.
The single most important thing for me is an ambitious or relatively ambitious decarbonisation target for 2030 at 100 grams or more, or less of carbon intensity. And that, at that type of level, then you continue to require offshore wind in the mix.
Okay, well, I can take a positive out of that. I don't know about you. I probably learned more than any of you have about offshore wind this evening. I thought it was fascinating, and I'd like you to thank our panellists in the usual way. Thank you very much.